Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, thank you. Home of aviation, birthplace of aviation.
Hopefully you're a long-time viewer, first-time caller.
First time watching the show, actually.
So tell me, this is your first book, just came out this week. Can you talk a little bit, just to start us off, on what made you decide to write a book? Like, what was the creative process around this?
That's a really good question. So what was happening was I was working as a contractor or as a consultant for, at that time it was for Booz Allen Hamilton, and I was working on an Air Force base in this analytics, I guess they call it analytics now, so this operations research center at a graduate school, and we were helping take Air Force research that the graduate students created and turn it into an application, because often the research turned into a paper and then it didn't turn into an application. So they needed a quick way to do that, and Excel was often the choice. So I came in as an Excel developer, and I was with a few other developers, and I wasn't exactly sort of top of my game at that point. But as I learned over time, I started questioning why people were doing what they were doing, and I didn't feel like we always had a good reason for it. So I started blogging on it. I think what happened was I was at a conference, and someone did an Excel talk, and I was just very unimpressed by it. And I thought, man, this stuff that they presented is 10 years old. So I thought, you know,
let me back. Why we do some of the things we do? What's an example?
Sorry. What do you mean?
Back when you said that you looked at why do we do some of the things you do?
Well, I'll get into that.
Okay.
I gotta get through the narrative first, otherwise I'll lose my train of thought. So just I'll get to that, okay? Because I talk a lot about that. But just to say that this guy had done something that was 10 years old, and I did not see other people, except for Chandu was one of them, Daniel Ferry of Excel Hero. They were doing new stuff, and I thought, I have something to contribute. I can do something new. So I started blogging about it, and I felt like I blog a lot, like I write a lot, and I felt like blogs were too short, and they started getting bigger and bigger. And then over time, as I was creating these on the side, I thought, holy crap, I have a book. You know, this is something that, and people are actually interested in what I have to say. So, so that's really the impetus behind it. And yeah, I think that's where we could stop. So to answer Oz's question, so one of those things is Hungarian notation, and I don't want to belabor this because I've argued about it so much already, and I think people are really just sick of it. But Hungarian notation is that VBA notation, or at least coding notation that says you start, and this is nothing against people from Hungary. Sorry, you know, Sylvia, I'm not trying to say anything about Hungarians. So
you're welcome.
Hungarian notation starts with the abbreviation of the first, usually a 3-letter abbreviation, and then for a variable, and then it has the thing, something describing a variable. So like a string would be str title, so that'd be a title, that would say string title, and people actually take this stuff and they bleed it over into named ranges. So they might say val response on a spreadsheet, value being something, a range on the spreadsheet. So this is not the best way to do it. I don't think it's the best way to do it. And for what it's worth, Microsoft has abandoned Hungarian notation. They do not encourage that you use it. The last time they encouraged it was probably Visual Basic 6.0. I mean, that's more than a decade ago. And yet we still do it. We still teach it. You know, something else, option explicit. I worked with someone, I know I've talked about this before, who said that they didn't like option explicit, and I found because it's not a standard. You know, you have to put it on. You have to set it as an option. So because it's not a standard, and you have to set it as an option, people are like, I'm not going to waste time with it. And I realized the code that they were producing was crap, and it was hard to go through and edit. I mean, you know, people would do things like, I have a test variable, so they'd write T for a test variable, and then they might write TT. I had one guy, he would write MMMM for like he was thinking, and then he would make that a test variable. I mean, that stuff, that is not something that belongs in a real product. It's one thing to do that on your own, but this is stuff that was for the Air Force community. I mean, And that's what I would have to deal with, taking old people's things and seeing this variable that says MMM or A1 or B1. I mean,
Right.
why do we teach people to abbreviate? I mean, is it really that hard to write a descriptive variable name?
Well, one of the things I noticed, Jordan, in going through the first few chapters of the book is first off, you did bring up that argument with, we'll say, with Bill Jelen and reference the Excel TV episode, so that was nice. But also, what I noticed is as you argued for the loose camel case, and then talked about naming conventions, and at first I was like, I don't really care, your naming convention or how you're gonna name a named range, just as an example. Who cares about that? And then as you started going from example to example to example, is how it flows through a logic stream and how it makes the VBA code at the very end so much more digestible. I thought was interesting. Would you mind just at the very highest level, just kind of briefly talk about how that's a contrarian view over what we see today?
Sure. So when most people code, and this is what I ran into arguing about Hungarian notation on my blog, most people code for themselves. I mean, this is the idea. So this is like the #1 argument I'm running up against with arguing anything differently, which is who the hell cares, right? Sorry, this is a family show. I shouldn't use those words.
We have a 7-second delay here. Can we please?
Cut that out. No, but I get very animated about this. So this is actually one of the #1 arguments against anything in life is who cares, right? It's certainly an argument against this. It's one I run into, and I think there's a fair point to it. So it's very hard to get people on my side without demonstrating it to them. But the simple answer is that there are two people you should code for. The first person is someone you hand this off to, so they understand what's going on. I mean, no one would be so silly as to argue. I mean, it's one thing for these people to create product and say, I don't want someone looking at my code to steal what I do, but no one would be so silly as to argue that you should deliberately code in a jumbled and mangled way so as no one can follow it. So, I mean, I've actually met people who've said that to me, but I think it's nonsense because of the second person you need to code for, and that's future you. You need to keep future you in mind because you're going to come back to this 2 months later, 6 months later, and you may have no idea what you did. Every time you sit down, it's going to be just learning a little differently. So that's really important because you need to be able to read your code, and that's part of understanding it. So that's what the people I say you should code for. Everyone else and future you.
So what you really is, if you're coding for a client, your biggest fear is that client might bring you back.
Right.
You have to interpret what you did.
Okay,
Right.
but all right. So you want your client to bring you back, but would you not say that it's a fair statement that it's a pretty small percentage of those clients that are actually going to go into your code and know how to make changes, or I mean, that's the question. They're bringing you in because you have a special skill. It's pretty rare, in my experience, it's pretty rare that the client is going to be the one maintaining code after I'm gone. They might call me up 6 months down the road and say, "Oh, change this, change that," but.
Well, I've had situations where say a recruiter says you got to be able to know VBA code, and why do they say that? Because a developer who's long gone wrote all this stuff, and they need somebody to be able to understand it, and it's not going to be them.
Right.
And any kind of development, we talk about that in the WordPress world. Your developer disappears on you. The client is not going to do it. They call another developer, and things are so customized, so undocumented. We just need to build you a whole new website, or spend $1 million on us trying to figure out what the hell they did.
Right.
And this is one thing that in one of the most fiery blog posts I wrote the 6 reasons not to use VBA or be careful, is because if there is a formula solution, you'll have an easier time of finding some random person who can deal with the formulas.
Usually.
VBA, use it when VBA is needed.
Yeah,
there are some cases when VBA is simpler, though.
Well,
a small percentage, but sometimes it's easier to use VBA. I'm just saying.
I talk about this stuff in the book. So to answer your question, Sylvia, about coding, okay? So the book was meant to be for several people. So for us consultants, you know, Rick said the fear is that they call us up and have us back. I mean, truth is in the consulting world, that's great. We love follow-on.
Yeah.
But
right
the thing to think about is that it's like Oz said, it's not just for us consultants. It's for people who work in departments who have to pass things on, and it's for people who are going away and they need to have their work have a legacy. I mean, you may think, well, who cares if I'm not the one working on it? I mean, you want to have some pride in your coding, but the main thing for me, because I don't code for other people anymore, is to code for future me. And I think that if a client, even when a client calls you back, all right, and you have to look at this code again, or not sometimes, all of us have code that we've liked, right, that we save and we keep it somewhere. Well, having a good structure for it is going to help us reuse it again. I mean, this is something, again, we talk about in the book. I go through this idea of reusable components because we should be building very broad-based capabilities that we can reapply. And part of that is having a good coding structure. And there was something I was going to address that Oz said, but now I forgot it. So, oh yeah, in terms of VBA, you know, I talk about this in the VBA chapter, which is if you do it simpler with formulas, do it with formulas. If you can do it simpler with VBA, do it with VBA. But don't use VBA under the guise of that being something that's advanced, because we all think, not we, a huge portion of Excel users out there think that advanced Excel is VBA. And that's something I want to challenge in this book, because it isn't just VBA. And in fact, using these ham-fisted VBA solutions, my old boss used to call it BF&I, which is brute force and ignorance. So that's what people do with these VBA solutions. And they make these spreadsheets that are just so colossal and so bloated and so hard to use and hard to understand and hard to interpret and even figure out what they did that it becomes not useful. And those are the people that the office calls the experts.
Right, but let me ask you one thing. Okay, so you and Kerry Walkins started talking about this. Kerry said that he wants to have as much VBA in the editor as possible. I know you're a fan of named ranges, and his argument was it's all there for you to deal with. And I'm gonna tell you, last night I was trying to follow something somebody did, and he's got these variables. And I don't know where the variables are defined. And I'm assuming that he's got some named range that he never showed in the video. So I've got all this code that doesn't work.
You know, I can't really, I don't know what to say for what that guy did. But I do talk about naming ranges such that you do know where they're defined. So, I mean, I also challenge how we name ranges, because I think that's important. So, as you know, as Rick was looking through it, he said that he thought, "Who cares?" And then over time, he's like, "Oh, this all makes sense together." So, you know, I want to keep this conversation high level so people can still, you know, listen and they don't have to. We don't have to go through everything, but it's all part of the same problem, whether it's VBA or whether it's formulas. It's the way you think about Excel. You need to build with future you in mind and other people. And if you do that, a lot of things extend from that.
On the subject of named ranges, Jordan, do you have similar strong opinions on naming conventions there?
Yes.
So, because, you know, you can kind of Hungarian notate, if you will, and named ranges as well, which, when you want to sort your variables, there is an argument to be made. Like, if I want to see all my table variables together, and, you know, I want to see them show up together in the list when I go into my name manager.
Yeah,
you know.
That actually, John Akampora, who's been reading my book, actually brought that up tonight before the episode about the table thing. So if you type in TVL, you start everything with table, and then you have the name afterward. And then if you say equals, you know, it'll give you your list of tables. My convention does not have a problem with that. So let me just show you an example. So if we're going to just keep this I'll describe what I do for people who end up listening. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. So I have this screen, and down below, in this really down below region, I have this tab that I've named calculations. So if I wanted to give this a named range here, I would call it calculations dot, and then I'd say, I don't know what we're going to call A1. Let's just call it total, calculations.total. Okay, so now I've given this named range. I've said where it is. I know what spreadsheet it's on. And I actually have a little bit more to do with this in the VBA backend, where we rename the because this is probably still sheet 1 in the backend, and we're going to rename it to calculations too. There. So if you have tables on this calculations sheet, you could say calculations dot and then give in your table name, give it the table name, and then later on in another sheet. So I've created a new sheet. I'm going to say equals, all right? And I've started typing in calculations.total. It pops up, and when I look at this, I actually see where it's located. I know where it is, and this still doesn't violate the problem I have in the name manager. In fact, if I'm looking at the name manager, which when you make named ranges very quickly, they become worksheet scoped. You know,
right.
They don't or workbook scope. They don't become scoped to the local sheet. Okay, so if I put the name in there, then I can sort those in the name manager, and I can see actually where they're located. And then if I use the shorthand brackets in VBA code, and I won't get into that, but I can use calculations dot something, and I know exactly what I'm referring to. So that's why.
Change the sheet name.
Sorry?
Provided you don't change the sheet name and have to go back and.
Well, this is why. I mean, you know, the stuff I do has a lot to do with developing these advanced applications. So there's no reason if you have something you call it calculations. So I say call it calculations or backend. Once you've picked a name for that, there's no reason that you should change it. I mean, I know that happens, but in my experience, once you've done this enough times, you usually pick a name that you stick with. I mean, what I deal with is people who say, oh, I have this sheet and it has some bit of analysis on it, and I want to make a copy of that sheet. So I'm going to make a copy of that, and then I'm going to call this 2 or 3. I talk about how to kind of fix that in the book, you know, keep a back-end database so you don't have all these sheets. But everything's all about creating these tight, compact spreadsheets and not trying to use more than you need to do.
So Jordan, I have 2 things for you before we head on to the next topic. Number one, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the difference between this book and the original dashboarding book, kind of what the difference is for our audience. And then number 2, you had some opinions about if statements, and that they're overused, and it, you know, something I believe Daniel Ferry, the Excel hero, agrees with as well. And Lord knows I've built if statements I've been proud of. And so I was hoping you could kind of talk about that as well as a contrary view. So hit on those 2 things and we'll move on.
So, okay, so the simple answer of this book is that it is an abridged, smaller version of the Dashboards book. So actually what happened was, it's been taking me like 2.5 years to write that freaking Dashboards book, and the publisher said, do you have a series of subset of chapters within that book that we could create a smaller book, an essentials book? Now that makes it sound like I'm repeating material. I'm not. We redid part of these chapters to some extent to make it for an essentials book. So think about it this way. This is the book that's like, here's what you do and how you do it. The Dashboards book has a lot more theory, and it has stuff on data visualization. It has stuff that isn't necessarily, I mean, there's a chapter where what I show you is in Excel, but you won't even need Excel to use it at all, because it's not, you know, it's on like, well, here are KPIs to put on your dashboards, here are prescriptive, descriptive, and predictive analytics. So there's a lot of theory in that. And I wanted to write that book because I think that there's a lot more of these types of books out there, which are good because I'm publishing one, so I don't want to insult it. But obviously this is going to fit nicely with a million other types of this type of book that says, here's how to do it, in and out. The Dashboards book is a lot broader because I think people, more than just wanting to know how to do something or what to do, they want to understand the underlying reason for it. And we talk about that in this book, and that's why, you know, I'm very contrarian in this book. And I say, even if you don't agree with me in this book, if for nothing else, that it helps you reestablish why you do what you do, that's a good thing. And the big Dashboards book is going to actually go into that with a lot more depth. Now, in addition, the Dashboards book is picking up a second author, and that's Chandu. I'm very grateful to have him on. He's going to write a few chapters for that book. When I originally started writing the Dashboards book, I was going to write this whole thing about how you can use Access in Excel. That was at the time Power Pivot was really not as mature as it is now. I think Power Pivot is actually very much the future now. I didn't back then. I really disliked it. But now that I see that it is, and I wanted Chandu, who's an expert in it, is doing really cool and new things with it, I wanted him on to help out with that. So those are the differences between this book. Tentatively, the new book is going to, or the Dashboards book, that's not new, it's old. The Dashboards book is going to release early next year. So right now, Amazon has it at 2016. That's just our publisher has not pushed the updates based on the discussions with Chandu and I yet. So there's going to be a few more things that have to happen before they push those updates, but they are coming. Okay, so answer your question about if formulas. So I did steal this from Daniel Ferry. I mean, let's be real here. I read that article he wrote on if being the most overused formula, and it really struck a chord with me because I had never seen anything like it before, and the stuff he was saying was so awesome, and it made so much sense. So here's what I say in the book, because there needs to be rules, and I'm not always against using if, but here's what I say. There are certain scenarios where you have a branching condition, right? So that's something where a nested if would work. So that means that if such and such happens, then we would expect these other results. And I know that's not really a good way of explaining it, but I'll get to that in a second. What we see if used for is for a lot of nonsense. So like we have Microsoft in its nested if example, it has this letter grade lookup where it has A, B, C, and D, and it uses nested ifs with a where you give it a raw score and it tells you what letter grade you have. Well, that is a lookup problem. That is not an if problem. Okay, that's not a condition because you don't receive a C because you didn't receive a B. I mean, I know that seems a little hard to understand, but that is a lookup problem based on an ordinal scale of grades. The underlying thing to understand that we're modeling are grades. That is a scale, right? We also see this with choose. Choose is a great function. People say, well, if it isn't this or if it isn't that. So choose lets you, you give it a number and then it returns, you give it an index number and it returns how many parameters out. And I urge everyone to look up choose. So if I give choose a 2, it's going to return what's 2 parameters out within that formula. People will use complicated ifs to recreate what choose does, all right? If you are looking up something specific, choose works, index works, these are lookup problems or tests of scale. They're not branching conditions problems. So you need to work backwards at your result and say, if I have this result, does it naturally follow from this previous condition? And if you write ifs in this way, again, this is the who cares argument. Who cares if it works? But if you write ifs in this way, you'll realize you'll more quickly understand what's going on because the formulas naturally model the underlying problem. And that is one of the big takeaways of the book. You need to code naturally. They call it semantic coding. I mean, semantic coding is related, but that is part of it. Semantic coding is big in HTML and the web world. There's no reason why we're not doing this. Like, why are we stuck with this old way of thinking about these problems? So,
yeah, I agree with you. I've actually written else or if-else statements until I've run out of space. and reading the chapter, I was like, it's just why wasn't I thinking about it that way? So with that in mind, that is a contrarian view, and